On the 11th of November 1918, the armistice bells rang across Europe, silencing the guns of the Great War, but in the heart of Germany, a different kind of battle was just beginning. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the German military down to a skeletal force of 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, prohibited an air force, and dismantled the general staff system that had made Prussia a military powerhouse. Yet from these ashes of humiliation, a group of visionary officers would forge the most devastatingly efficient war machine the modern world had ever witnessed. General Hans von Zicht stood in his sparse office in Berlin, examining the restrictions that were meant to castrate German military power forever. Where others saw limitations, this austere Prussian officer saw opportunity. As the chief of the Reichswehr, the permitted German army, von Zicht understood that quality must replace quantity. He initiated a radical transformation that would become the foundation of Germany's future military dominance. The general implemented a revolutionary concept. Every soldier would be trained to perform the duties of ranks above their own. A private learned to think like a sergeant like a lieutenant, and officers studied the responsibilities of their superiors. This vertical integration of knowledge created a military force where initiative and independent thinking replaced rigid hierarchy. When expansion came, as von Zicht privately believed it would, Germany would have a ready-made officer corps hidden within its enlisted ranks. Von Zicht's reforms extended beyond training methodology. He secretly partnered with the Soviet Union, establishing clandestine training facilities on Russian soil where German officers could experiment with tanks and aircraft, forbidden weapons under the Versailles Treaty. At Kazan, German pilots trained on fighters and bombers. At Lipetsk, they developed tactical aviation doctrine. Near Saratov, German officers commanded tank formations and tested mechanized warfare concepts that would later terrorize Europe. The reference for Germany's secret military collaboration with the Soviet Union during the Weimar period can be found extensively documented in historical archives and scholarly works, including Manfred Seidler's Reichswehr und Rote Armee and documents from the German Federal Archives. The emphasis on mobility and offensive action became doctrine. German military theorists studied the stalemate of the Great War and concluded that future conflicts must avoid static trench warfare. They examined the writings of British military thinker J.F.C. Fuller and absorbed the ideas of French theorist Charles de Gaulle, ironically learning more from these foreign minds than those nations' own military establishments did. Captain Heinz Guderian, a signals officer, became obsessed with tank warfare. He envisioned not merely armored support for infantry, but entire divisions of tanks that could penetrate enemy lines, encircle opposing forces, and create chaos in rear areas. His ideas were revolutionary and controversial, dismissed by traditionalists who still believed cavalry had a place on modern battlefields. Yet the Reichswehr encouraged such radical thinking. War games and theoretical exercises explored combined arms operations where tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft would function as synchronized instruments. The small army became a laboratory for military innovation, testing concepts that larger, complacent military establishments ignored. Officers published articles debating tactics, attended rigorous staff colleges, and participated in demanding field exercises that stressed realistic combat conditions. The economic devastation of the Great Depression paradoxically aided military thinking. With limited resources, German planners developed the concept of Wehrwirtschaft, a war economy that emphasized strategic targeting of enemy industrial capacity rather than broad-front advances. They identified petroleum, steel production, and transportation networks as critical vulnerabilities. Destroy these, German theorists argued, and enemy armies would collapse regardless of numerical superiority. By the early 1930s, Germany possessed something remarkable: a small but superbly trained military force, a doctrine emphasizing speed and aggression, secret expertise in forbidden weapons, and a generation of officers who thought independently and creatively about warfare. The restrictions of Versailles had inadvertently created a military culture that prioritized excellence over size, innovation over tradition, and initiative over rigid obedience. On the 30th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the careful, methodical military development of the Reichswehr was about to receive virtually unlimited resources and political support. The new regime's aggressive foreign policy and open disdain for the Versailles Treaty would transform the theoretical innovations of the previous decade into concrete reality, though not always in ways the professional military officers anticipated or desired. Hitler's rise catalyzed immediate military expansion. Within months, the secret programs became open realities. The Luftwaffe emerged from the shadows, no longer hidden in Soviet training grounds but parading openly through German skies. Tank production, previously disguised as agricultural tractors, now proceeded without pretense. The 100,000-man army began expanding toward objectives that would have seemed fantastical just years earlier. General Werner von Blomberg, appointed Minister of War, oversaw the dramatic buildup. By 1935, Germany openly repudiated the military clauses of Versailles, announcing conscription and revealing an air force that already possessed thousands of aircraft. The international community protested but took no meaningful action, emboldening the regime to accelerate rearmament. Heinz Guderian received command of Germany's 1st Panzer Division in 1935. Finally, he could test his theories with actual forces rather than theoretical exercises. The Panzer Division represented a radical departure from conventional military organization. Rather than attaching tanks to infantry divisions, Guderian created self-contained formations where tanks were the primary arm, supported by motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance units all traveling at comparable speeds. The training regimen Guderian implemented emphasized aggression, speed, and independent action by junior officers. Tank commanders practiced off-trags tactic, mission-type tactics where superiors communicated objectives rather than detailed instructions. Subordinate commanders determined methods to achieve those objectives, fostering initiative and allowing rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. This decentralized command philosophy would prove devastatingly effective against armies that required permission from higher headquarters for significant decisions. Germany's officer corps studied recent conflicts with analytical rigor. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, and the Japanese campaigns in China provided laboratories for observing modern warfare. The Condor Legion, German forces fighting in Spain ostensibly as volunteers, tested aircraft tactics and combined arms coordination under combat conditions. They learned that close air support could substitute for artillery, that radio communications enabled unprecedented coordination, and that aggressive exploitation of breakthrough could collapse enemy armies before they reorganized defensive lines. Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Condor Legion air operations, pioneered techniques for air-ground coordination. Aircraft didn't simply bomb strategic targets, but functioned as flying artillery, striking tactical targets in direct support of ground forces. Dive bombers, particularly the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, proved effective at destroying specific targets like bridges, command posts, and artillery positions. The psychological effect of dive bombers, their screaming sirens terrifying troops below, became an additional weapon in the German arsenal. The expansion created challenges. Rapid growth meant many officers and non-commissioned officers lacked the thorough training that characterized the Reichswehr era. Von Siecht's vision of every soldier trained above their rank became difficult to maintain when divisions multiplied faster than training facilities could accommodate. Some traditionalists worried that quantity was replacing quality, that the exceptional standards of the small professional army would dilute in mass conscription. Yet certain advantages persisted. The German armaments industry, though initially smaller than those of Britain or France, concentrated production on fewer, more standardized models. While the Allies produced dozens of aircraft types in small quantities, Germany focused on proven designs, simplifying logistics and maintenance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, the Ju-87 dive bomber, and the Heinkel He-111 medium bomber became standard equipment, with spare parts and trained mechanics readily available. German logistics officers studied railroad capacity, fuel consumption rates, and ammunition expenditure with scientific precision. They calculated that mechanized divisions required approximately 300 tons of supplies daily, mostly fuel and ammunition. This seemingly mundane analysis would prove critical in campaign planning, distinguishing German operations from those that collapsed when supply lines overextended. By 1938, Germany possessed approximately 51 divisions, including several panzer and motorized divisions. More importantly, it possessed doctrine, training, and command culture that emphasized offensive action, combined arms coordination, and exploitation of enemy weakness. The theoretical innovations of the 1920s, tested in the 1930s, awaited only the opportunity to demonstrate their effectiveness in actual warfare. On the 1st of September, 1939, at precisely 4:45 in the morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig. Simultaneously, 53 divisions of the Wehrmacht crossed into Poland from 3 directions, initiating the first full-scale test of Germany's revolutionary military doctrine. The world was about to witness blitzkrieg, lightning war, though German commanders rarely used that journalistic term themselves. The German plan, Fall Weiss or Case White, demonstrated the evolution in military thinking. Rather than advancing on a broad front as armies had done in the Great War, German forces concentrated armor and motorized units into Schwerpunkt, points of maximum effort, designed to penetrate Polish defenses and drive deep into enemy territory. These armored spearheads would bypass resistance, leaving infantry divisions to reduce pockets, while panzers raced toward strategic objectives. General Fedor von Bock commanded Army Group North, attacking from Pomerania toward Warsaw. General Gerd von Rundstedt led Army Group South, advancing from Silesia and Slovakia. The Polish army, brave and determined but organized along traditional lines with cavalry still prominent, found itself facing a type of warfare for which its doctrine provided no answers. Polish defenders fought tenaciously, but their command structure couldn't cope with the tempo of German operations. When Polish commanders identified German positions and planned counterattacks, those positions had already moved. Radio communications allowed German forces to coordinate movements in real time, while Polish reliance on telephone lines and messengers meant their information was hours old before reaching commanders. The Luftwaffe established air superiority within days, though not through the complete destruction of the Polish Air Force, a myth that later propaganda exaggerated. Polish aircraft, dispersed to auxiliary airfields, continued flying missions throughout the campaign. However, German numerical superiority, superior pilot training, and more advanced aircraft gradually wore down Polish air resistance. More critically, German air attacks on railroad junctions, bridges, and communication centers disrupted Polish mobilization and troop movements. General Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps demonstrated the potential of concentrated armor. His forces advanced over 40 miles on the first day, far exceeding Great War standards. Tank commanders led from the front, making rapid decisions without consulting higher headquarters. When encountering resistance, they bypassed it, maintaining momentum while infantry divisions following behind reduced the surrounded positions. The concept of the Kesselschlacht, the encirclement battle, reached fruition. German pincers closed around Polish forces near Radom and Bzura, creating vast pockets containing hundreds of thousands of troops. Traditional military thinking emphasized capturing territory. German doctrine emphasized destroying enemy forces. Surrounded Polish units couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, and their supply situations became desperate within days. The campaign revealed both strengths and weaknesses in German execution. Logistics occasionally faltered. Rapid advances meant supply columns struggled to maintain pace with combat units. Some panzer divisions temporarily halted not from enemy action, but because they outran their fuel supplies. Commanders learned that exploitation must balance speed against logistical sustainability. Combat losses among German armor proved surprisingly high. Polish anti-tank guns, though outmatched, destroyed numerous tanks. Light tanks, the Panzer I and Panzer II that constituted the majority of German armor, proved vulnerable even to heavy machine gun fire. German planners recognized the need for better armed and armored vehicles, leading to increased production of the Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks. Polish cavalry, often mythologized as charging tanks with lances, actually fought dismounted as dragoons, using horses for mobility rather than mounted combat. They achieved several tactical successes, particularly the counterattack at Bzura that temporarily threatened German flank positions. However, tactical victories couldn't overcome operational-level encirclements. The Polish command, fractured by disrupted communications and rapid German movements, couldn't coordinate a coherent defense. Warsaw's siege showcased both German capabilities and brutal methods. When the Polish garrison refused surrender, German artillery and aircraft subjected the city to intensive bombardment. The Luftwaffe flew over 1,300 sorties on September 25th alone, dropping high explosive and incendiary bombs that devastated civilian areas. The psychological dimension of German warfare, the use of terror to break enemy will, emerged clearly, foreshadowing darker patterns in later campaigns. By October 6th, organized Polish resistance ceased. The campaign lasted 35 days, demonstrating that properly executed mechanized warfare could achieve decisive victory in timeframes previously unimaginable. Germany suffered approximately 16,000 killed and 32,000 wounded, losses considered moderate given the strategic victory achieved. Poland lost perhaps 60,000 killed in action, with hundreds of thousands more captured. On the 10th of May, 1940, German forces attacked westward, initiating Fallgelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Military experts worldwide expected a prolonged stalemate similar to the Great War, with formidable French fortifications along the Maginot Line and substantial Allied forces deployed in defensive positions. What followed instead became the most stunning operational-level victory in modern military history, demonstrating the maturation of German doctrine and the devastating effectiveness of properly executed maneuver warfare. The German plan emerged from unexpected origins. The original operational concept, similar to the Schlieffen Plan of 1914, called for a massive right wing sweeping through Belgium and Holland. General Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff to Army Group A, considered this approach predictable and likely to produce the broad front stalemate Germany needed to avoid. He proposed instead a radical alternative: concentrate armor in the Ardennes forest, break through at Sedan, and drive rapidly to the English Channel, cutting Allied armies in two. The High Command initially dismissed Manstein's proposal. The Ardennes, heavily wooded and hilly, seemed unsuitable for armor. Von Manstein found himself transferred to command an infantry corps in the east, effectively silencing his objections. However, Hitler, intrigued by unconventional thinking and attracted to bold operational concepts, summoned Manstein to Berlin in February 1940. After hearing the proposal directly, Hitler ordered the plan adopted, overruling his own military staff. The revised strategy, called Sichelschnitt or sickle cut, massed 7 panzer divisions in the Ardennes, forming a striking force that would penetrate the weakest point in Allied defenses. Army Group B would attack through Holland and Belgium, drawing Allied forces northward into the trap. Once Allied armies committed to Belgium, Army Group A would strike through the Ardennes, race to the coast, and encircle the entire northern Allied force. At dawn on May 10th, German forces attacked simultaneously across a front stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Paratroopers seized key bridges and fortifications in Belgium and Holland. The Luftwaffe launched massive strikes against Allied airfields. Panzer divisions rolled forward across multiple fronts, creating the appearance of a broad offensive that obscured the true Schwerpunkt in the Ardennes. General Heinz Guderian commanded 19th Panzer Corps, part of the massed armor driving through the Ardennes. His forces, along with other Panzer Corps commanded by Hermann Hott and Georg Hans Reinhardt, navigated the supposedly impassable forest roads in a carefully orchestrated procession. Traffic control became as important as tactics, with military police directing the flow of thousands of vehicles through narrow roads. French intelligence detected the movement but misjudged its significance. Allied commanders, focused on the German advance through Belgium, assumed the Ardennes thrust represented a supporting attack or feint. They positioned their strongest forces, including the British Expeditionary Force and France's best mechanized divisions, to counter the German advance in Belgium, exactly as German planners anticipated. On May 13th, Guderian's panzers reached the Meuse River at Sedan, the critical obstacle before open terrain leading to the Channel coast. French defenders, primarily reserve divisions composed of older soldiers with limited training, occupied fortifications along the river. German doctrine called for combined arms assault, artillery bombardment, dive bomber attacks coordinated with ground forces, and engineer units supporting tank crossings. The Luftwaffe flew over 1,600 sorties supporting the Sedan crossing, the greatest concentration of air power yet seen in support of a ground operation. Stuka dive bombers struck French artillery positions, bunkers, and troop concentrations with devastating accuracy. The psychological effect proved as important as physical destruction, with French soldiers abandoning positions under the relentless aerial assault. German engineers, under fire, assembled pontoon bridges while infantry established footholds on the western bank. By evening, tanks began crossing. Guderian drove forward relentlessly, disregarding exposed flanks and logistics concerns, maintaining momentum that prevented French commanders from organizing coherent counterattacks. His forces advanced 45 miles in 48 hours, a pace that shattered French command cohesion. French General Maurice Gamelin, the supreme Allied commander, struggled to comprehend the situation. Reports arriving at headquarters contradicted each other, with panzer sightings scattered across a widening front. The fluid battle exceeded the French command system's ability to process information and issue coherent orders. By the time Gamelin understood the danger, German panzers had created a bulge 60 miles wide and 50 miles deep, with no significant forces blocking their drive to the coast. On May 15, Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister of Britain, telephoned French Premier Paul Reynaud. Churchill expected reassurance about French counterattacks. Instead, Reynaud declared, "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill, stunned, flew to Paris the next day to assess the crisis personally. On the 16th of May, 1940, General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps resumed its westward drive despite receiving halt orders from nervous superiors who feared the extended flanks and rapid advance courted disaster. Guderian, employing a mixture of aggressive interpretation of orders and deliberate insubordination, continued what he termed a reconnaissance in force, which happened to involve his entire corps racing toward the English Channel. This decision exemplified the German command culture that empowered subordinate commanders to seize opportunities, even when it meant disregarding caution from higher headquarters. The landscape of northeastern France offered ideal terrain for mechanized warfare. Unlike Poland's numerous rivers and forests, this region featured rolling farmland, with excellent roads radiating westward. German panzers exploited this geography ruthlessly, advancing up to 50 miles daily, unprecedented mobility that left Allied commanders perpetually reacting to outdated information. French attempts at counterattack revealed the fundamental disparity in operational tempo between the two armies. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding France's 4th Armored Division, launched an assault against the German flank near Montcornet on May 17th. His division, hastily assembled and lacking coordination between tank, infantry, and artillery elements, achieved initial success before German anti-tank guns and tactical air support halted the advance. De Gaulle's attack demonstrated courage but also highlighted the difference between having tanks and executing effective armored warfare. British General Edmund Ironside, chief of the Imperial General Staff, urged French commanders to attack southward, while British forces struck north, cutting the German corridor. The plan possessed theoretical merit, but implementing coordinated offensives required communication, logistics, and command cohesion that the deteriorating situation made impossible. Allied forces found themselves psychologically paralyzed, unable to believe that the Germans had achieved such rapid penetration and fearful that any movement might expose them to encirclement. On May 20th, German panzer forces reached the English Channel at Abbeville. Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Balk's 1st Rifle Regiment, part of Guderian's corps, secured the coastal town at 8:30 in the evening, completing the sickle cut. Allied armies in Belgium and northern France, including the entire British Expeditionary Force, France's 1st Army Group, and Belgian forces, found themselves trapped in a pocket with their backs to the sea. The encirclement, encompassing over 1 million Allied troops, represented an operational victory of stunning proportions. In 10 days, Germany had achieved what 4 years of fighting in the Great War had not. the decisive defeat of French military power. Yet the campaign was far from over. Trapped armies still possessed substantial combat power, and destroying rather than merely encircling them became the next German objective. Allied forces retreated toward a perimeter around Dunkirk, the last significant port remaining in Allied hands. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo, an emergency evacuation effort. The British Admiralty assembled hundreds of vessels, from naval destroyers to civilian fishing boats, to rescue troops from Dunkirk's beaches and harbor. On May 24th, German forces received controversial halt orders just as they approached Dunkirk. Debate continues regarding this decision. Some historians argue Hitler feared tank losses in the canal-crossed terrain around Dunkirk and preferred letting the Luftwaffe complete the destruction. Others suggest Army Group A needed time to consolidate after the rapid advance. Regardless of motivation, the pause allowed Allied forces to establish defensive positions and begin evacuation. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, supported the halt, believing his exhausted panzer divisions needed maintenance and reorganization before the next phase of operations. The tanks had driven over 200 miles in 10 days, suffering mechanical breakdowns and requiring fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. From a logistics perspective, the pause made sense. From an operational perspective, it surrendered initiative at a critical moment. The Luftwaffe confidently claimed it could prevent evacuation, and Hermann Göring, commanding the German Air Force, personally assured Hitler that no substantial forces would escape. This promise proved dramatically incorrect. British and French troops established a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, holding off German ground forces while evacuation proceeded. The Royal Air Force, flying from bases in southern England, contested German air superiority, engaging in fierce battles that prevented the Luftwaffe from dominating the beaches. Between May 26th and June 4th, Operation Dynamo evacuated 338,000 British and French troops from Dunkirk. The operation, hailed as a miracle of deliverance in Britain, salvaged the British Army's trained manpower, despite abandoning virtually all heavy equipment. Churchill famously observed that wars are not won by evacuations, but the preservation of Britain's professional army would prove strategically significant. German forces resumed the attack on May 27th, but the temporary pause had allowed Allied defenses to solidify. The campaign around Dunkirk demonstrated that even defeated armies, fighting defensively with their backs to the sea, could impose significant costs. German casualties in the Dunkirk fighting exceeded those of the entire race to the Channel, revealing the difference between exploitation through undefended territory and direct assault against prepared positions. The evacuation's success partially obscured the magnitude of France's defeat. Germany had torn apart the Allied position in the north, captured or scattered entire armies, and demonstrated operational superiority that shattered French military prestige. The campaign's second phase, the drive south to complete France's conquest, remained. On the 5th of June 1940, German forces initiated Fall Rot, Case Red, the final offensive to conquer France. The northern campaign had destroyed France's best armies and most mobile forces. What remained were exhausted divisions spread across defensive lines extending from the Channel to the Maginot Line. The outcome seemed inevitable, yet the campaign would demonstrate both the completeness of German operational mastery and the continued bravery of French soldiers fighting despite impossible circumstances. General Maxime Weygand, who replaced Gamelin as Supreme Allied Commander, organized defense along the Somme and Aisne rivers. He established the Weygand Line, a defensive system based on strongpoints rather than continuous trenches, designed to absorb German attacks and preserve mobile reserves for counterattacks. The concept showed tactical sophistication, but France lacked the resources, time, and troop quality to implement it effectively. German forces attacked with overwhelming superiority. Army Group B assaulted across the Somme, while Army Group A struck eastward. The Wehrmacht now deployed 133 divisions against France's 65 remaining divisions, many of which were undermanned and demoralized. More critically, Germany possessed complete air superiority and maintained the initiative, choosing when and where to attack. French soldiers fought bravely in many sectors, inflicting casualties and demonstrating that the French army's defeat resulted from operational-level failures rather than lack of courage. At Saumur, cadets from the cavalry school held Loire River bridges against German armor for 3 days. At Stone, French forces repelled multiple German assaults, with the village changing hands 17 times in fierce fighting. These tactical successes, however, couldn't influence the operational collapse unfolding around them. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. On June 10th, Italy declared war on France, opening a new front in the Alps. Mussolini, observing France's imminent defeat, sought to claim a share of victory despite contributing almost nothing to achieving it. Churchill bitterly observed that Mussolini's decision to attack defeated France resembled a jackal following a wounded lion. On June 10th, the French government evacuated Paris, declaring the capital an open city to spare it from destruction. German forces entered Paris on June 14th, marching down the Champs-Élysées in a propaganda spectacle showcasing their triumph. Newsreel footage of German soldiers at the Eiffel Tower and Arc de Triomphe symbolized France's humiliation and Germany's dominance. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a great war hero appointed deputy prime minister, advocated for armistice, arguing that continued resistance would only increase French suffering without changing the outcome. Premier Paul Reynaud, who favored continuing the fight from North Africa, resigned when his cabinet refused to support further resistance. Pétain became premier and immediately requested armistice terms. The armistice negotiations, held in the forest of Compiègne on June 22nd, carried heavy symbolism. Hitler insisted the ceremony occur in the same railroad car where Germany signed the armistice ending the Great War. The deliberate humiliation underscored that this victory represented not merely military conquest but revenge for 1918's defeat. The armistice divided France into occupied and unoccupied zones. Germany controlled northern France and the Atlantic coast, securing industrial regions and preventing Britain from establishing bases near the Channel. The unoccupied zone, centered on the town of Vichy, maintained nominal sovereignty under Pétain's government, though subject to German oversight. France would pay occupation costs, demobilize most of its army, and surrender individuals wanted by Germany, including anti-Nazi German refugees. German casualties in the entire French campaign totaled approximately 45,000 killed and 111,000 wounded. Losses considered remarkably light given the magnitude of victory achieved. France suffered 90,000 killed, 200,000 wounded, and approximately 1,800,000 captured or missing. The British Expeditionary Force lost 11,000 killed and 14,000 wounded, with 40,000 captured. The campaign's outcome shocked the world. France, considered possessing Europe's premier army, had fallen in 6 weeks. The Maginot Line, that enormous fortification system that consumed vast resources, was bypassed and rendered irrelevant. Static defensive thinking had proven catastrophically inadequate against mobile, aggressive offensive doctrine. Military observers worldwide drew sobering conclusions. Germany had developed warfare methods that rendered traditional approaches obsolete. The combination of armor, tactical aviation, radio communications, and decentralized command culture created operational tempo that overwhelmed opponents psychologically before destroying them physically. Other nations scrambled to understand and replicate these methods, though understanding theory and implementing practice proved vastly different challenges. Britain now stood alone against Germany, having lost its major continental ally and facing possible invasion. The collapse of France represented the most significant strategic transformation of the war's first year. Germany's ruthlessly efficient military had validated its doctrine in the harshest test possible, sustained operations against a peer competitor. The question became whether this efficiency could overcome the strategic challenges that lay ahead. On the 13th of August 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag Eagle Day, initiating sustained air operations against Britain intended as preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain would test whether German military efficiency, so devastatingly effective on continental battlefields, could achieve strategic victory through air power alone. The campaign would reveal that tactical excellence and operational skill could not compensate for strategic miscalculation and inadequate resources. Germany approached the air campaign with confidence derived from previous victories. The Luftwaffe had established air superiority over Poland and France rapidly, enabling ground forces to operate with minimal interference. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that Britain could be forced to negotiate through aerial bombardment, making a costly amphibious invasion unnecessary. The strategic situation differed fundamentally from previous campaigns. Britain, an island nation with substantial naval forces, could not be attacked by panzer divisions. Germany's navy, inferior to the Royal Navy, could not guarantee secure sea lanes for invasion forces. Air superiority represented not merely a tactical advantage but an absolute prerequisite for invasion. The Luftwaffe faced the burden of achieving strategic victory through operational-level air operations, a task for which neither its equipment nor doctrine was optimized. German intelligence significantly underestimated the Royal Air Force's capabilities. Luftwaffe planners believed Britain possessed approximately 600 fighters. The actual number exceeded 700, with production increasing monthly. More critically, Britain had developed an integrated air defense system combining radar stations, observer corps, communication networks, and fighter control rooms that allowed efficient allocation of fighter resources against incoming raids. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding RAF Fighter Command, employed defensive tactics that frustrated German objectives. Rather than engaging in massive dogfights that would produce dramatic battles but deplete fighter strength, Dowding husbanded resources, rotating squadrons to maintain fresh pilots, and accepting temporary local defeats to preserve overall combat capability. This attritional approach required patience and strategic perspective, but matched Britain's strategic situation. German attacks initially targeted radar stations, airfields, and aircraft production facilities, legitimate strategic objectives. The Luftwaffe achieved tactical successes, damaging numerous airfields and inflicting significant fighter losses. However, the British air defense system proved resilient, with damaged facilities rapidly repaired and fighter production exceeding losses. Germany lacked the sustained operational capacity to suppress British air defenses completely. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe shifted strategy, launching major daylight raids against London. The decision, partly retaliatory for RAF raids on Berlin and partly intended to force decisive air battles, relieved pressure on fighter command airfields at a critical moment. Dowding's forces, strained by weeks of intense fighting, gained respite as German bombers targeted cities rather than military infrastructure. The bombing of civilian populations, intended to break British morale and force government capitulation, achieved the opposite effect. Churchill's government, backed by public determination to resist, refused negotiations. British fighter pilots, many exhausted from sustained combat, continued contesting German raids with increasing effectiveness as they gained experience fighting against German formations. German losses mounted unsustainably. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's premier fighter, possessed limited range, allowing only minutes over Britain before fuel concerns forced return to bases in France. Bomber formations, inadequately defended, suffered heavy casualties when intercepted by British fighters. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe lost 60 aircraft in a single day, losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. References to the Battle of Britain's statistics and operational details are extensively documented in official RAF records and post-war analyses, including the Air Historical Branch's The Battle of Britain official history. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely on September 17th, tacitly acknowledging that air superiority, the invasion's prerequisite, would not be achieved. The Luftwaffe continued nighttime bombing through the Blitz, but these attacks, while destructive and deadly, could not achieve the strategic objective of forcing British surrender. The failure over Britain exposed fundamental limitations in German military capabilities. The Wehrmacht excelled at continental warfare, where mechanized forces could achieve decisive results through operational maneuver. It lacked, however, strategic bombing forces capable of sustained operations against industrial economies, sufficient naval forces to dominate sea approaches, and the long-range fighters necessary to establish air superiority over hostile territory defended by competent opposition. German military efficiency, so impressive at tactical and operational levels, existed within strategic constraints that doctrine and training could not overcome. The specialized forces and focused doctrine that enabled rapid continental victories proved inadequate for broader strategic challenges. Victory over Britain required capabilities Germany had not developed: heavy four-engine bombers, long-range escort fighters, and naval forces sufficient to challenge British maritime supremacy. The campaign revealed another limitation. German intelligence gathering and analysis remained inadequate for strategic air operations. The Luftwaffe systematically underestimated British fighter strength, recovery capacity, and public resilience. Operational planning relied on optimistic assumptions rather than rigorous analysis. The same military that excelled at tactical intelligence and operational deception struggled with strategic assessment. By autumn 1940, German military leadership confronted uncomfortable realities. Britain remained undefeated and defiant. The United States, while neutral, increasingly supported Britain through material assistance. Germany's military, designed for rapid decisive victories, faced the prospect of protracted conflict requiring sustained industrial output and resource allocation. The efficiency that won campaigns might prove insufficient to win the war. On the 22nd of June 1941, at precisely 3:15 in the morning, German artillery opened fire along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, heralding Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers, organized into 153 divisions including 19 panzer divisions, attacked eastward in history's largest military operation. This campaign would demonstrate both the apex of German operational capabilities and the fundamental strategic overreach that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Hitler viewed war with the Soviet Union as inevitable, driven by ideological hatred of communism, racial theories regarding Slavic peoples, and desire for living space and resources in the East. The decision to attack, made despite Britain's continued resistance, committed Germany to a two-front war, the strategic nightmare that had led to defeat in the Great War. German military leadership harbored doubts but believed rapid victory possible before Britain and potentially America could effectively intervene. The operational plan divided forces into 3 army groups. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would advance through Belarusia toward Moscow. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would attack through Ukraine toward Kiev and the industrial Donets Basin. The plan emphasized encirclement battles, using panzer forces to create vast pockets containing Soviet armies. Initial German success exceeded even optimistic projections. Soviet forces, despite outnumbering German attackers and possessing more tanks and aircraft, found themselves operationally overwhelmed. Stalin's purges of the Red Army in the late 1930s had decimated experienced leadership, executing or imprisoning thousands of officers, including innovative theorists who had developed Soviet mechanized warfare doctrine. The officers who remained were often mediocre loyalists, fearful of initiative that might be interpreted as treasonous. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group executed a massive double encirclement near Minsk, trapping 300,000 Soviet soldiers within days. The operational pattern established in France repeated on a larger scale: rapid penetration, deep exploitation, and encirclement of enemy forces caught in cauldrons before they could retreat. Within 3 weeks, Army Group Center had advanced 450 miles, halfway to Moscow. Soviet forces fought with desperate courage but tactical incompetence. Political commissars, Stalin's ideological enforcers attached to military units, often overruled professional military judgment. Retreats, even tactically necessary ones, were forbidden as defeatism. Units stood and died rather than withdrawing to defensible positions. This combination of political interference and leadership purges created exactly the conditions German operational doctrine exploited: immobile forces vulnerable to encirclement. The scale of Soviet losses proved staggering. By December 1941, Germany had captured approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners, destroyed or captured over 20,000 tanks and 21,000 aircraft, and occupied territory containing 65 million people. No military in history had suffered such catastrophic losses in 6 months. Yet the Soviet Union had not collapsed, had not sued for peace, and continued fielding new armies from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. German commanders began recognizing disturbing patterns. Distances in Russia exceeded anything experienced in Western Europe. A single Soviet front spanned distances greater than the entire front in France. Logistics, always challenging in rapid operations, became nightmares. Soviet railroads used wider gauge track than European railways, requiring either track conversion or transfer of supplies to captured Soviet rolling stock at border areas. Roads, adequate in summer, became bottomless mud in autumn rains and ice-rutted tracks in winter. Equipment proved inadequate for Russian conditions. Tank and vehicle engines designed for moderate European climates froze in Russian winters. Lubricants thickened, reducing mechanical efficiency. Weapons malfunctioned. Soldiers, issued standard uniforms, suffered frostbite and hypothermia as temperatures plunged far below zero. The vaunted German logistics system, so efficient in Western Europe's developed transportation networks, struggled with vast Russian distances and primitive infrastructure. The Battle of Moscow, beginning in October 1941, marked the campaign's climax. German forces, exhausted from months of sustained offensive operations, pushed toward the Soviet capital in Operation Typhoon. Initial advances created more massive encirclements, capturing additional hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. By late November, German reconnaissance units reached Moscow's outskirts, observing the Kremlin spires through binoculars, yet German forces could advance no further. Depleted combat units, strung out along overextended supply lines, lacked strength to break through desperate Soviet resistance. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. Vehicles froze. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses. On December 5th, Soviet forces launched counteroffensives, driving German armies back from Moscow in the first significant German retreat of the war. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding Soviet forces defending Moscow, employed tactics adapted from painful lessons. Rather than committing forces piecemeal, he accumulated reserves secretly, launching concentrated counterattacks that exploited German exhaustion and logistical weakness. The Red Army, learning from catastrophic defeats, began developing competent operational leadership and effective combined arms tactics. The failure before Moscow represented more than a tactical reverse. Germany had committed its finest divisions, commanded by experienced officers, employing proven doctrine, yet failed to achieve strategic objectives. The Blitzkrieg approach, predicated on rapid victory before logistical limitations constrained operations, encountered an opponent with sufficient strategic depth and manpower reserves to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. German operational efficiency could not overcome strategic miscalculation. On the 23rd of August 1942, German Sixth Army reached the Volga River in Stalingrad, beginning a battle that would symbolize the turning point of Germany's Eastern War. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding Sixth Army, had driven east through the summer in Case Blue, Germany's second major offensive in Russia, aimed at capturing the Caucasus oil fields and severing Soviet supply routes along the Volga. The campaign would demonstrate how operational skill, divorced from strategic wisdom, could lead a superbly trained military into catastrophe. The urban fighting in Stalingrad deviated fundamentally from German doctrine. Blitzkrieg emphasized mobility, exploitation, and encirclement in open terrain. Cities, with their rubble-filled streets and countless buildings providing defensive positions, negated advantages in maneuver and concentrated forces into attritional battles. German commanders recognized this, but felt compelled to capture the city bearing Stalin's name for both propaganda and strategic reasons. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commanding 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, developed tactics specifically countering German advantages. He kept Soviet forces close to German lines, sometimes only meters away, preventing effective artillery bombardment or air support since any fire would hit German troops. Combat occurred in basements, sewers, and ruined buildings, with positions changing hands multiple times. German soldiers, trained for mobile warfare, found themselves fighting room to room in conditions resembling the trench warfare their doctrine had been designed to avoid. While 6th Army ground forward in Stalingrad, Soviet High Command prepared Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment targeting Romanian forces protecting German flanks. The Red Army had learned from Germany's operational methods, secretly concentrating armor and mechanized forces, maintaining radio silence, and using maskirovka, deception operations, to conceal preparations. The Soviets would implement Kesselschlacht, the encirclement battle, against its German inventors. On November 19th, Soviet forces attacked northward from Stalingrad's southern approaches and southward from the north, targeting weak Romanian positions. These satellite forces, poorly equipped and less motivated than German troops, collapsed under the assault. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers closed at Kalach on the Don River, encircling 6th Army, elements of 4th Panzer Army, and Romanian forces, approximately 290,000 troops trapped in the Stalingrad pocket. General Paulus requested permission to break out westward while Soviet encirclement remained incomplete. Hitler, influenced by Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air, refused. The decision to hold Stalingrad became one of the war's greatest strategic blunders. Supplying 6th Army required delivering 700 tons of material daily. The Luftwaffe never achieved even 200 tons, with harsh winter weather, Soviet air defenses, and inadequate transport aircraft making the effort futile from the start. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding the hastily organized Army Group Don, attempted relief with Operation Winter Storm in December. His forces, weakened by transfers to other sectors, advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket before Soviet reinforcements halted the attack. Manstein urged Paulus to break out toward his relieving forces, but Paulus, bound by Hitler's orders to hold Stalingrad, refused to attempt breakout without explicit authorization that never came. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated catastrophically. Rations decreased to starvation levels. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies exhausted. Wounded soldiers froze to death in unheated ruins. Horses were slaughtered and consumed. The vaunted German logistics system, optimized for offensive operations, proved incapable of sustaining a surrounded force in hostile territory. German efficiency, so impressive in campaign planning and tactical execution, offered no solutions to strategic disaster. Soviet forces systematically compressed the pocket through January 1943. On the 31st of January, Paulus, recently promoted to field marshal by Hitler, in a gesture implying he should commit suicide rather than surrender, chose surrender instead. German resistance collapsed over the following 2 days. Of the 290,000 troops originally encircled, approximately 90,000 emaciated survivors entered Soviet captivity. Only 6,000 would survive imprisonment to return home years later. Stalingrad represented more than a significant German defeat. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Wehrmacht shattered. German soldiers, not Soviet masses, had been encircled and destroyed. German generals, not inexperienced Soviet commanders, had been outmaneuvered operationally. The Red Army demonstrated it had learned modern warfare's lessons, could concentrate forces secretly, achieve surprise, and execute complex operations effectively. The broader strategic situation deteriorated simultaneously. In North Africa, British forces defeated the Afrika Korps at El Alamein in November 1942, forcing German and Italian forces to retreat westward. Anglo-American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, establishing Allied presence in North Africa. The strategic initiative was shifting to Germany's opponents. Germany's military, still professionally competent and capable of tactical excellence, faced insurmountable strategic problems. Fighting across multiple fronts against opponents with superior industrial capacity and manpower reserves created attrition Germany could not sustain. The efficiency that won campaigns proved insufficient for protracted multi-front warfare against coalitions whose combined resources vastly exceeded Germany's. On the 6th of June 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, opening a Western front that would finally force Germany to fight the two-front war its strategic planning had sought desperately to avoid. The Wehrmacht, despite retaining tactical proficiency and motivated soldiers, faced overwhelming material superiority, strategic exhaustion, and an Allied coalition that had learned from bitter experience how to counter German operational methods. The ruthlessly efficient military machine that dominated Europe in 1940 would be systematically ground down over the next 11 months. German forces in the West, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, prepared to defend France against anticipated invasion. Strategic disagreements plagued defensive planning. Rommel advocated defeating the invasion on the beaches, believing Allied air superiority would prevent effective counterattacks inland. Rundstedt favored maintaining mobile reserves to contain breakthroughs and launch powerful counteroffensives. Hitler, characteristically, imposed compromise that satisfied neither approach, scattering forces that achieved neither beach defense strength nor concentrated mobile reserve. The Allied landings demonstrated how thoroughly the operational environment had shifted. Germany no longer possessed air superiority. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, attacking any movement during daylight. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude convinced German high command that Normandy represented a feint preceding the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais, causing critical delays in committing reserves. When panzer divisions finally received orders to move toward the beachhead, they suffered constant air attacks that slowed movement and inflicted significant casualties. German defenders fought with skill and determination in the Norman hedgerows, imposing heavy casualties on attacking Allied forces. The bocage terrain, with its thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, favored defense and negated Allied advantages in mobility. Individual German units achieved tactical successes, counterattacking effectively and making Allies pay heavily for limited advances. Yet tactical excellence could not overcome strategic reality. Allied forces possessed inexhaustible supplies, complete air superiority, and growing numerical advantage as reinforcements arrived faster than German replacements. On the Eastern Front, Soviet summer offensives demonstrated how completely the Red Army had matured. Operation Bagration, launched June 23, 1944, destroyed German Army Group Center through a massive encirclement operation that mirrored Germany's own methods from earlier years. Soviet forces, now equipped with excellent tanks like the T-34, supported by capable tactical aircraft, and commanded by experienced officers, executed combined arms operations that rivaled German effectiveness. The operation destroyed 28 German divisions, killed or captured approximately 400,000 soldiers, and drove Soviet forces to Poland's borders. German forces continued fighting with remarkable tenacity. The July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, organized by army officers who recognized the war was lost, failed and triggered brutal purges that killed or imprisoned thousands of officers. The army oath to Hitler, which many officers took seriously, combined with fear of retribution against families and ideology regarding fighting to the last, kept German forces cohesive despite hopeless strategic position. The Western Allies broke out from Normandy in late July through Operation Cobra, American forces punching through German lines at St. Lo. Once in open country, Allied armor exploited breakthroughs exactly as German doctrine prescribed, racing across France faster than German forces could establish new defensive lines. Paris fell in late August. By September, Allied forces approached Germany's western border. German industry, despite years of bombing, continued producing weapons in remarkable quantities. Armored vehicle production actually peaked in 1944, with factories delivering thousands of tanks, including technically superior models like the Panther and Tiger. Yet numbers could not compensate for fuel shortages, inadequate training for replacement crews, and loss of experienced personnel. New German soldiers, rushed through abbreviated training, lacked the skills that characterized the pre-war professional military. The Ardennes Offensive, launched December 16, 1944, represented Germany's final major offensive operation. 3 armies, assembled secretly, attacked through the Ardennes forest, aiming to reach Antwerp and split Allied forces. Initial attacks achieved surprise and tactical success, demonstrating that German operational planning and execution capabilities remained formidable. However, the offensive lacked sustainable logistics, sufficient air support, and the operational freedom that characterized earlier campaigns. Within 10 days, American forces halted the advance. By late January 1945, German forces had retreated to starting positions, having suffered casualties they could not replace. The Red Army launched its final offensives in January 1945, crushing German defenses in Poland and advancing toward Berlin. Western allies crossed the Rhine in March, penetrating into Germany's industrial heartland. German forces continued fighting, sometimes ferociously, but organized defense became impossible as command structures fractured and supply systems collapsed. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, recognized reality and authorized surrender negotiations. On May 8, 1945, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed unconditional surrender documents. The war in Europe ended. Germany's military, so ruthlessly efficient in war's early years, had been utterly destroyed. The professional army that invaded Poland had been consumed in Russia's vastness. The officer corps that pioneered modern operational warfare had been killed, captured, or dispersed. The tactical and operational excellence that stunned the world in 1940 proved insufficient against coalitions possessing superior resources, industrial capacity, and ultimately, comparable operational skill. The sources of German military efficiency, the factors analyzed at this narrative's beginning, had created remarkable short-term capability. Intensive training, decentralized command culture, emphasis on initiative, combined arms doctrine, and focus on operational maneuver had enabled stunning victories. Yet these strengths existed within fatal strategic weaknesses: inadequate industrial base for protracted warfare, insufficient resources for multi-front conflict, and leadership that committed forces to unwinnable campaigns based on ideology rather than rational strategic calculation. The German military's ruthless efficiency won campaigns but lost the war. Operational excellence proved insufficient without strategic wisdom, tactical skill meaningless without sustainable logistics, and professional competence irrelevant when directed toward fundamentally flawed objectives. The most efficient military machine of its era ultimately demonstrated that efficiency in service of catastrophic strategy leads inevitably to comprehensive defeat.